The political earthquake that just shattered Westminster has left Keir Starmer's government in absolute chaos. What Richard Tice unleashed mere minutes ago isn't just another parliamentary debate. It's a calculated political demolition that's exposing the most explosive contradiction in Labour's entire migration policy, while Starmer's cabinet sits in their wealthy constituencies with virtually zero asylum seekers. Reform UK just forced a vote that will redistribute thousands of migrants directly onto Labour and Liberal Democrat doorsteps. The meltdown happening right now inside Number 10 is unlike anything we've seen, and the desperate scrambling from government ministers tells you everything you need to know. This isn't political theatre anymore. This is the moment the entire migration crisis lands exactly where the architects of open border policies likely live. Richard Tice stood in Parliament just moments ago and delivered what political analysts are already calling the most devastating intervention of this entire parliamentary session. The Reform UK deputy leader didn't just propose policy, he detonated a political bomb that's sending shockwaves through every Labour and Liberal Democrat council in Britain. His amendment to the Asylum and Immigration Bill contains one brutally simple provision that's causing absolute pandemonium in government circles. Every council in the United Kingdom will now receive asylum seekers in direct proportion to how their MPs voted on migration legislation over the past 5 years. The silence that followed this announcement in the Commons was deafening, and the faces of Labour frontbenchers told the complete story. This is the political checkmate they never saw coming, and there's absolutely no escape route. The genius of Tice's strategy is in its mathematical precision. Reform UK's research team spent months analysing voting records, correlating them with actual asylum seeker placement data, and what they discovered is nothing short of scandalous. Conservative-held councils have been absorbing nearly 73% of asylum accommodation, despite representing only 42% of the population. Labour constituencies, particularly those held by cabinet ministers, have processed dispersal agreements that place an average of just 8 asylum seekers per 10,000 residents. Compare that to working class areas in the Red Wall, where the numbers exceed 200 per 10,000. And you begin to understand why Tice's proposal has government ministers in absolute freefall. The data doesn't lie, and now it's about to become legally binding policy. Starmer's immediate response was textbook political panic. Within minutes of Tice finishing his speech, the Prime Minister was demanding an emergency recess, claiming the proposal required detailed impact assessments and cross-departmental analysis. But everyone watching knew exactly what this really meant. Starmer needs time to calculate how many asylum seekers will end up in Holborn and St Pancras, his own constituency, which currently hosts fewer than 50 asylum seekers, despite having a population of over 90,000. His Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, represents Pontefract, Castleford and Nottingley, an area that's already struggling with integration challenges, yet her voting record has consistently supported expansion of asylum intake without corresponding expansion of the dispersal programme to wealthier areas. The hypocrisy is now impossible to hide, and the political cost is about to become very real. The Liberal Democrats are in even worse shape. Ed Davey's Kingston and Surbiton constituency is one of the wealthiest in London, with average house prices exceeding £700,000. Current asylum seeker numbers there, 32. That's 32 individuals in a constituency of 81,000 people. Meanwhile, Lib Dem MPs have voted for every single expansion of asylum commitments, while their own communities remain virtually untouched by the practical consequences. Tice specifically called out this disparity in his speech, reading out constituency by constituency breakdowns that had Lib Dem MPs physically squirming in their seats. The camera shots of their reactions are already going viral on social media, and the public response is absolutely brutal. But the real masterstroke in Tice's proposal is the enforcement mechanism. Local councils won't be able to simply refuse or drag their feet on implementation. The amendment ties asylum dispersal funding directly to compliance, meaning any council that fails to meet their proportional quota will face immediate cuts to their overall Home Office funding. For wealthy Labour and Lib Dem councils, this creates an impossible choice: accept the asylum seekers and face constituent backlash, or refuse and watch their budgets collapse. It's political game theory at its most ruthless, and Tice knows that either outcome destroys the credibility of MPs who've spent years lecturing working class communities about tolerance and compassion while ensuring their own areas remained insulated from the consequences. The numbers behind this proposal are staggering. If implemented, Tice's amendment would redistribute approximately 42,000 asylum seekers currently housed in hotels and temporary accommodation in working class areas. Analysis suggests that Islington, the spiritual home of champagne socialism, would need to accommodate an additional 3,000 asylum seekers. Camden, another Labour stronghold filled with £1 million townhouses, would see numbers increase by 2,700. Oxford West and Abingdon, held by the Lib Dems, would go from hosting 71 asylum seekers to over 1,800. These aren't abstract statistics anymore. These are real people who will need housing, healthcare, school places and social services in communities that have spent decades voting for increased migration while remaining completely isolated from its practical impacts. The government's counter-argument is already falling apart under scrutiny. Angela Rayner attempted to claim that the proposal was unworkable and would undermine social cohesion in areas unprepared for sudden demographic changes. The irony was immediately seized upon by Reform MPs, who pointed out that working class communities have been dealing with exactly these challenges for years without any government concern for their social cohesion. When communities in Rochdale, Rotherham or Middlesbrough raised concerns about rapid demographic change, they were dismissed as racist. Now that the changes might affect Hampstead or Richmond, suddenly social cohesion matters. The double standard is so blatant that even traditionally Labour-supporting media outlets are struggling to defend it. The political calculation happening inside Labour headquarters right now is absolutely frantic. Party strategists are running demographic models on every marginal constituency, trying to determine which seats become unwinnable if Tice's amendment passes. The results are catastrophic for Labour's electoral prospects. Internal polling obtained by a political journalist suggests that 63 Labour-held constituencies would flip to Reform UK if asylum seekers are redistributed according to Tice's formula and current migration levels continue. These aren't red wall seats that recently turned Conservative. These are traditional Labour strongholds where the party assumed loyalty was guaranteed. The working assumption inside Labour has always been that middle-class Labour voters support migration in principle because they never experience its challenges in practice. Tice's proposal destroys that comfortable separation, and Labour's focus groups are showing panic among exactly the demographic that forms their electoral coalition. The timeline of this political earthquake is crucial to understanding why Starmer is in complete meltdown mode. Tice's amendment came with a sunset clause requiring implementation within 4 months. That's not enough time for Labour to water down the proposal through committee amendments or bureaucratic delay. It's also perfectly timed to hit just before local elections, meaning Labour and Lib Dem councillors will face voters while this controversy is at its absolute peak. Reform UK's political strategists clearly wargamed every aspect of this, understanding that the compressed timeline forces immediate political consequences rather than allowing the issue to fade from public consciousness. Starmer needs this to go away, but the procedural mechanisms ensure it will dominate the news cycle for months. The reaction from Labour backbenchers reveals deep fractures in the party's coalition. MPs representing working class constituencies are refusing to support leadership attempts to block Tice's amendment. They've spent years watching their communities transform while being told by party leadership that raising concerns makes them complicit with the far right. Now they're seeing wealthy Labour MPs in leafy constituencies panic at the prospect of accommodating even a tiny fraction of what their communities handle routinely. The resentment is boiling over in private WhatsApp groups and parliamentary tea rooms. Several Labour MPs have already indicated they'll vote with reform on this specific amendment, not because they've defected, but because they're tired of the hypocrisy and want their own leadership to experience the policies they've imposed on others. Starmer's attempt to whip his MPs into line is facing unprecedented resistance. The Prime Minister called an emergency meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party, where he reportedly argued that supporting Tice's amendment would be playing reform's game and undermining party unity. Multiple sources inside that meeting described the response as hostile. MPs from constituencies like Hartlepool, Stoke and Great Grimsby stood up and asked directly why their communities should continue bearing a disproportionate burden. When Starmer suggested that integration works better in areas with existing migrant communities, he was confronted with data showing that many of the constituencies designated for increased asylum seeker placement under current policy have no such communities. The accusation levelled at party leadership was direct and devastating. Labour protects wealthy Liberal constituencies at the expense of working class areas. The media response to this controversy has been fascinating in revealing establishment bias. BBC's initial coverage framed Tice's proposal as controversial and divisive. Language they never applied to policies that concentrate asylum seekers in working class areas. The Guardian ran an opinion piece arguing that wealthy areas lack the infrastructure for asylum support, completely ignoring that they lack such infrastructure precisely because they've never been asked to build it. The establishment media's attempt to defend the status quo is so transparent that even their own comment sections are filled with readers pointing out the obvious double standard. When similar concerns were raised by working class communities, these same outlets published think pieces about confronting prejudice and the moral necessity of welcoming refugees. Now that Hampstead might need to welcome them, suddenly practical considerations matter. The international dimension of this crisis is also emerging. Tice's research team uncovered that Britain's asylum dispersal policy is unique among European nations in how heavily it concentrates asylum seekers in economically deprived areas. Germany's dispersal system distributes asylum seekers based on federal, state, population and tax revenue, explicitly ensuring wealthy areas take proportional responsibility. France's system similarly prevents concentration in struggling regions. The Netherlands uses a housing availability formula that results in far more even distribution and across income levels. Britain's system is an outlier specifically because it allows wealthy areas to opt out through various mechanisms while placing legal obligations on councils that lack resources to resist. Tice is essentially proposing that Britain adopt the European standard, which makes Labour's opposition look even more indefensible. The economic argument Labour is attempting to deploy is equally hollow. Government ministers are claiming that wealthy areas lack affordable housing stock suitable for asylum accommodation. This argument ignores the massive stock of properties in Labour and Lib Dem constituencies that could be requisitioned or leased for exactly this purpose. It also conveniently forgets that Labour has consistently argued that asylum seekers should be integrated into communities rather than segregated in budget accommodation. If that principle is genuine, then asylum seekers should be placed across all housing stock, including in areas where ministers and MPs actually live. The fact that Labour is suddenly discovering practical objections to their own integration philosophy the moment it affects their own constituencies is political hypocrisy at its most naked. The constitutional crisis brewing around this amendment is unprecedented in modern British politics. If Tice's proposal passes and Labour attempts to block implementation through executive action, Reform UK has already indicated they'll seek judicial review. The legal argument is straightforward. Parliament has spoken and the executive cannot simply ignore legislation because it's politically inconvenient. Multiple constitutional law experts have confirmed that if the amendment passes both Commons and Lords, the government has no legal basis for non-implementation. Starmer's team is searching desperately for procedural mechanisms to prevent the vote from happening at all. But the parliamentary arithmetic isn't in their favour. The government needs opposition support to block private member amendments to asylum legislation, and Reform isn't the only party that sees political advantage in forcing Labour to live with their own policies. The constituent responses flooding into MP offices reveal the raw political reality behind this controversy. Labour MPs in wealthy constituencies are being inundated with emails and calls from voters expressing concerns about school capacity, healthcare access and neighbourhood character. These are precisely the concerns that, when raised by working class voters, are dismissed as code racism. But now that wealthy Labour supporters are voicing identical concerns, the party is taking them seriously. Multiple Labour MPs have scheduled emergency constituency meetings to discuss the potential impact of asylum dispersal, meetings they never offered to working class constituents who've been dealing with these issues for years. The contrast in how the party treats different demographics within its own coalition has never been more obvious, and political opponents are documenting every instance of this hypocrisy for future campaign material. The specific cases Tice highlighted in his parliamentary speech are devastating in their detail. He presented data on a council estate in Sheffield where 400 asylum seekers were placed in a community of 3,000 residents, straining local schools and GP surgeries to breaking point. When local MPs raised concerns, they were told resources would be allocated, but those resources never materialised. Tice then compared this to the neighbouring wealthy suburb, represented by a Labour MP who voted for asylum expansion, where exactly 0 asylum seekers have been placed. He read out email exchanges between local housing officials and Home Office representatives showing explicit instructions to avoid placement in areas where it might generate media attention or political sensitivity. The implication was clear: working class areas have neither political voice nor media sympathy, so they're designated as dumping grounds for policies wealthy Liberals support in theory, but refuse to experience in practice. The financial implications of redistribution are equally explosive. Wealthy councils receive dramatically higher per capita funding than their working class counterparts, yet they currently spend virtually nothing on asylum support services. Tice's proposal would force them to allocate resources comparable to what struggling councils already spend. Analysis by Reform UK's policy unit suggests that councils like Westminster would need to increase asylum-related spending by approximately £40 million annually to meet proportional obligations. That's funding that would come from the same budget currently spent on heritage preservation, cultural festivals and other amenities that wealthy residents expect. The political pain of explaining to constituents why their council tax is increasing to fund asylum services they never wanted is exactly what Labour MPs have been inflicting on working class areas for years. Now it's coming home. The demographic data underpinning Tice's argument is impossible to refute. Britain's asylum seeker population is currently concentrated in areas with median household incomes below £24,000 annually. Areas with median incomes above £45,000 host less than 8% of asylum seekers, despite representing nearly 30% of the population. The correlation between voting patterns and asylum placement is even more stark. Constituencies where MPs voted for increased asylum quotas in the past Parliament host an average of 53 asylum seekers per 10,000 residents. Constituencies where the same MPs actually live host an average of 11 per 10,000. The statistical disparity is so extreme that it cannot be explained by housing availability, local services, or any of the other justifications government ministers are attempting to deploy. It's pure political manipulation, and Tice has the receipts. The historical precedent for this kind of political redistribution is worth examining. In the 1960s, when the United States implemented school desegregation, wealthy liberal areas in northern cities strongly supported the principle, while their own schools remained effectively segregated through residential patterns. It wasn't until busing programs forced actual integration in wealthy neighbourhoods that political support collapsed and white flight accelerated. Britain's asylum dispersal system has operated on the same principle. Wealthy Liberals support refugee resettlement as long as it happens somewhere else. Tice's proposal is the equivalent of those busing programmes, forcing the people who design these policies to actually live with their consequences. The political panic this is generating among Labour leadership suggests they understand exactly what happens when virtue signalling meets practical reality, and the European comparison becomes even more damning when examining specific cities. Hamburg, a wealthy German city, hosts over 15,000 asylum seekers integrated throughout its districts, including affluent areas. Stockholm's dispersal system places asylum seekers across all neighbourhoods based on available housing, regardless of property values. Copenhagen's system explicitly prevents concentration in lower income areas.